on a warm Texas afternoon, the kind of day where cicadas hummed in the oak trees and gossip traveled faster than the wind, the little town of Greenwood turned out for a wedding no one could stop talking about. The bride, Sarah Collins, was 32, striking in her white lace gown, her hair swept into a soft bun that made her look like she'd just stepped out of a bridal magazine. She carried herself with quiet confidence, but if you looked closely, there was something in her eyes, a flicker of nerves, of uncertainty, that didn't quite match the perfection of the moment. The groom, Robert Bobby Hale, was 10 years older, 42, and impossible to ignore. He was a mountain of a man, weighing well over 500 pounds, dressed in a custom tuxedo that strained against his frame. When he walked down the aisle, the wooden floor of the church groaned beneath him, a sound that made more than one guest shift uncomfortably in their pews. For weeks, the town had been buzzing about them. Bobby was wealthy, heir to a successful trucking business, and owned a sprawling ranch just outside town. Sarah had been working at a boutique on Main Street, scraping by after a string of breakups and dead-end jobs. To outsiders, it looked like a fairy tale of opposites, Beauty and the Beast, as one local paper boldly headlined. But in private conversations at diners and barbershops, the tone was sharper. Was Sarah really in love, or was she in it for the money? And could Bobby, a man so self-conscious about his size and so used to whispers following him wherever he went, truly believe he had finally found the kind of love that had always escaped him? Inside the church, however, none of that mattered. Bobby cried openly as Sarah walked toward him, his round face shining with sweat and tears, his massive hands trembling as he reached for hers. When the pastor asked if he would take Sarah to be his wife, Bobby's "I do" cracked with emotion, and Sarah's soft "I do" followed like an echo. The guests clapped, some with genuine happiness, others with thin smiles masking their doubts. Still, when they kissed, it looked, for that fleeting moment, like love had triumphed. The reception was lavish, held in a banquet hall dripping with fairy lights and overflowing with flowers. Bobby had spared no expense, determined to give Sarah the kind of wedding that would silence the whispers. Guests feasted on barbecue, steaks, and a towering 3-tier cake decorated with sugar roses. Sarah danced with her friends, smiling, laughing, her gown swishing across the floor. Bobby mostly sat at the head table, a drink in hand, watching her with a mix of pride and hunger, as if afraid that if he let her out of his sight too long, she might disappear. To many who watched, the pairing felt uneasy. Sarah's beauty seemed almost fragile next to Bobby's bulk, her steps light where his were heavy. But what unsettled people most wasn't the contrast in their bodies. It was the question that lingered behind every smile. Was this real love, or a bargain neither dared to name? As night fell and the reception ended, the couple left in a black limousine, waving to a crowd of guests who tossed birdseed into the air. They were headed to a luxury hotel in Dallas for a short honeymoon before Bobby returned to his business and Sarah to her new life on the ranch. The last image many saw was Bobby, red-faced and beaming, helping Sarah into the car with surprising tenderness, his enormous hand swallowing hers as he shut the door. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect ending, tension was already brewing. Bobby's insecurities, Sarah's unspoken doubts, and the whispers of a town that never truly believed in them. These were the invisible guests at their wedding, following them into the night. What no one knew was that by the time the sun rose again, their fairy tale would already be shattered, and the story the town would tell for years to come would no longer be about love or spectacle. It would be about death. Long before the wedding bells rang, the paths that led Sarah Collins and Robert Bobby Hale together were already lined with shadows of insecurity, compromise, and choices neither of them could fully escape. To understand why their union felt both inevitable and doomed, you have to look at where they came from and what they carried with them to the altar. Sarah had grown up in a modest home just outside of Greenwood, the kind of house where the roof always seemed to need patching and bills were more constant than comforts. Her father worked in construction until an accident left him partially disabled, and her mother pieced together shifts at a diner. Sarah learned early that stability was fragile and love didn't always pay the rent. By her late 20s, she was still struggling, working at a boutique on Main Street, charming customers with her smile while quietly calculating how far her paycheck would stretch. She was known in town for her looks, tall, graceful, with warm brown eyes that seemed to hold secrets. But beauty didn't cover medical bills or buy a future, and she knew it. She had loved before. Mark Bennett, her high school sweetheart, had once been her ticket out, dreams of moving to Austin, building a life, maybe even college. But Mark's ambitions fizzled, replaced by late nights, drinking, and bad decisions. The breakup was painful, and though they went their separate ways, the connection never fully died. Sarah's friends knew she sometimes still answered his late-night calls, even years later. To them, it was a weakness. To Sarah, it was unfinished business. Bobby's past carried different scars. He had always been the big kid, the one teased relentlessly in school, the one who couldn't run a mile or fit into the football jerseys his cousins wore with ease. Food was comfort, and as he grew older, his size became both his shield and his prison. By the time he inherited his father's trucking business in his 30s, Bobby was already over 450 pounds. His wealth grew, but so did his isolation. In private, Bobby could be tender, reading poetry he never dared share, keeping journals where he wrote about his loneliness. But when it came to relationships, fear ruled him. He was desperate to believe in affection, yet always waiting for proof it was fake. Every laugh he heard in public, he assumed was about him. Every sideways glance, he interpreted as judgment. By the time he met Sarah, those insecurities had hardened into suspicion. Their meeting seemed almost scripted by fate. Sarah was at a community fundraiser, modeling clothes for a charity fashion show. Bobby, a sponsor for the event, sat in the front row. He saw her walk across the stage, and something inside him shifted, like the world had. Briefly made sense. He introduced himself afterward, fumbling, sweating, but determined. Sarah, flattered by his attention and intrigued by his wealth, didn't turn him away. At first, their relationship was more transactional than romantic. Bobby showered her with gifts, designer handbags, dinners in Dallas, a new car. Sarah accepted them with a practiced smile, convincing herself that comfort could grow into love. And in some ways it did. Bobby treated her with a devotion she hadn't experienced before, always checking if she was comfortable, always eager to please. There were moments, small ones, where she thought maybe this could work, maybe kindness mattered more than passion. But beneath that surface, both of them carried doubts. Sarah's friends whispered that she was marrying up, that she'd found her golden ticket. She hated how their voices echoed her own late-night fears. Did she love Bobby, or did she love what he provided? For Bobby, the doubt was even sharper. He couldn't stop imagining that Sarah still longed for someone else, someone thinner, younger, stronger. When he noticed her scrolling through her phone with a faint smile, he wondered if she was texting Mark. The closer the wedding came, the more those doubts twisted into quiet resentments. Bobby grew possessive, wanting to know where she was, who she talked to. Sarah grew defensive, tired of his questions, but unwilling to let go of the financial safety he promised. On the surface, they told the world it was love. They posed for engagement photos in cowboy boots and denim. Sarah perched delicately on Bobby's lap while he grinned nervously at the camera. To the people of Greenwood, the pictures looked forced, like two actors cast in the wrong play. Still, they went through with it. Sarah told herself she was building a future, one where she wouldn't have to struggle like her parents had. Bobby told himself he had finally found a woman who chose him, not just his wallet. Neither admitted the truth, that both of them were bargaining, trading pieces of their lives in hopes of something that looked like happiness. By the time the wedding day arrived, the stage was already set. The town's gossip wasn't wrong, but it wasn't the whole story either. Sarah wasn't purely a gold digger, and Bobby wasn't purely a victim. They were two flawed people colliding at the worst possible time, carrying too much history, too much doubt, into a marriage that was supposed to start fresh. And once those insecurities spilled into their honeymoon suite, they would prove fatal. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the kind of Texas sky that seemed painted for celebration. By noon, the church was already full, and outside, curious onlookers lined the street just to catch a glimpse. For a small town like Greenwood, this wasn't just a wedding. It was an event, a spectacle. People whispered as Sarah Collins stepped from the white limousine, her lace gown trailing like a ribbon of light against the concrete. She looked every bit the picture of a fairy tale bride. But the whispers weren't just about her beauty. They were about the man waiting at the altar. Inside, Robert Bobby Hale stood nervously, sweat dampening the collar of his custom tuxedo. His sheer size made him impossible to ignore, but it was the emotion on his face that caught people off guard. He was trembling, his eyes red, his lips pressed together in a mix of pride and fear. When Sarah began her walk down the aisle, his tears flowed freely. He wasn't ashamed. He wanted everyone to see how much he loved her, how grateful he was that someone so radiant had chosen him. The ceremony itself was simple but charged with meaning. The pastor spoke of loyalty, of patience, of love that endures. Bobby's voice cracked when he said, "I do," and Sarah's soft reply echoed through the hushed sanctuary. Cameras flashed, capturing the kiss, the applause, the carefully staged happiness. In that instant, even the skeptics had to admit, it looked like love. The reception was another story altogether. Bobby had spared no expense, transforming the Greenwood Banquet Hall into something out of a Dallas socialite's dream. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above tables draped in satin. Waiters carried trays of champagne, and a live band played country ballads mixed with pop hits. Guests feasted on smoked brisket, buttered rolls, and an extravagant three-tier cake that seemed to wobble under the weight of sugar roses. Sarah was radiant on the dance floor, twirling with her bridesmaids, laughing easily, her veil catching the light as she moved. Bobby danced only once, holding Sarah close for their first dance. He whispered something in her ear. No one could hear what, but his massive hands clutched her waist tightly, almost possessively. After that, he retreated to the head table, watching as Sarah mingled, his gaze never leaving her. Some noticed, some didn't, but those who felt uneasy. It wasn't the look of a man content. It was the look of a man afraid to lose what he had just gained. As the night drew on, speeches filled the room. Sarah's maid of honor spoke of childhood dreams and new beginnings. Bobby's cousin joked awkwardly about how the big man had finally found a bride, the words landing heavier than he intended. Sarah laughed politely, but Bobby's smile faltered, his eyes darting toward the crowd as though searching for ridicule. In Greenwood, jokes about Bobby's size had followed him his whole life, and though he had grown used to pretending they didn't sting, tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was supposed to prove them all wrong. By midnight, the newlyweds were ready to leave. Guests lined the exit, tossing birdseed and cheering as Sarah and Bobby climbed into a sleek black limousine. Sarah waved through the window, her face flushed from champagne and dancing. Bobby, grinning wide, lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it as though to claim her in front of them all. Cameras flashed, capturing a perfect ending. But the real story was just beginning. The limousine carried them to Dallas, where a luxury hotel suite awaited. A short honeymoon before the realities of married life settled in. The suite was elegant, with a king-size bed covered in rose petals, champagne chilling in a silver bucket, and a city skyline glittering through the window. Sarah slipped off her heels, sighing with relief, while Bobby sat heavily on the edge of the bed, watching her with a mix of exhaustion and desire. At first, the night carried the kind of nervous tenderness expected of a honeymoon. They laughed awkwardly, shared a toast, even kissed with a sweetness that seemed genuine. But beneath the surface, tension hummed. Bobby's insecurities simmered, his doubts about Sarah's loyalty pressing in like a weight he couldn't shake. Sarah, tired and a little tipsy, grew distant, scrolling through her phone when she thought he wasn't looking. That was when Bobby's smile faltered. He asked her what she was doing, his voice light at first, then sharper when she brushed him off. She slipped the phone into her purse, saying it was nothing. But Bobby's mind spun with suspicion. Was she texting Mark? Was she laughing at him behind his back? His body tensed, his breathing heavy, the air in the suite growing thick with unspoken accusations. In the hallway, other guests later reported hearing raised voices. A thud, a woman's sharp cry, then silence. What happened behind that hotel door in the hours after their perfect wedding day would turn their love story into a headline, and their honeymoon suite into a crime scene. The suite on the 12th floor was quiet, the kind of hush that felt heavy rather than peaceful. The champagne on the table had gone flat, the rose petals scattered across the bed already starting to curl at the edges. Sarah slipped into a silk nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders, her bare feet padding softly across the carpet. Bobby watched her from the bed, his massive frame hunched forward, eyes narrowed with a look she hadn't seen before. "What were you doing on your phone?" he asked, his tone calm but cold. Sarah paused, brushing her hair back, avoiding his stare. "Just checking messages." "It's nothing." "Nothing," Bobby repeated, the word rolling off his tongue with disbelief. His hands clenched the bedsheets, the fabric tightening beneath his grip. "Who were you talking to?" The silence stretched too long. Sarah's eyes darted toward her purse on the dresser, the faint glow of the screen still visible between the folds of fabric. That tiny flicker was all it took to confirm what Bobby already feared. He lurched to his feet, the bed groaning as his weight lifted, and grabbed the phone. "Bobby, don't," Sarah snapped, lunging forward. But he was faster, scrolling through her messages with trembling fingers until the words appeared before him. "I miss you. Wish you were here. Sent to Mark." Bobby's breath grew ragged. His vision tunneled, sweat dripping down his temples. "You're still talking to him," he whispered, his voice breaking. "On our wedding night." Sarah's face flushed, a mix of guilt and defiance. "It's just words, Bobby. It doesn't mean anything. I married you, didn't I?" But to Bobby, those words cut deeper than any confession. They weren't reassurance. They were betrayal dressed as justification. His mind replayed every whisper from the townspeople, every smirk he thought he saw at the reception, every cruel joke from childhood. In that moment, he wasn't just a groom betrayed. He was the boy who had always been laughed at, the man who had always been doubted, and the husband who had always feared this day would come. "You used me," he growled, his voice trembling with rage. "You were never really mine." Sarah backed away, her arms out as if to create space between them. "Calm down, Bobby. We can talk about this." But Bobby wasn't listening. His insecurities, his jealousy, his humiliation, all of it erupted. He lunged forward, his sheer weight pinning Sarah to the bed. She gasped, clawing at his shoulders, her cries muffled under the press of his chest. "Stop. Bobby, please," she choked, her legs kicking desperately against the mattress. To Bobby, it felt like he was holding on to her, refusing to let her slip away. But the harder he clung, the more her body thrashed, the more her breath faltered. His hands wrapped around her wrists, pressing them into the mattress as his body bore down. Sarah's face turned red, her mouth opening in a silent scream, her eyes wide with terror. Minutes felt like hours. Bobby's rage blinded him to the reality that Sarah's struggles were growing weaker, that her cries had faded to faint whimpers, that the fight was draining from her body. It wasn't until her head lolled to the side, her lips parted, her chest no longer rising, that the haze lifted. Bobby froze. "Sarah," he whispered, shaking her gently. Her body was limp, her eyes glassy. He pulled back, stumbling off the bed, his heart hammering in his chest. "No, no, no, no." He staggered to the phone, dialing the front desk with trembling fingers. "My wife, she's not breathing. It was an accident. Please, send help." His voice cracked, frantic, desperate. Within minutes, hotel staff were pounding on the door. When they entered, they found Bobby kneeling beside the bed, his massive frame shaking as he tried to perform CPR. His tuxedo shirt was ripped open, his face streaked with tears. Sarah lay motionless on the bed, her skin pale under the harsh glow of the lamp. Paramedics arrived, working quickly, but it was too late. At 3:14 a.m., Sarah Collins was pronounced dead in the same gown she had worn only hours earlier as she danced at her own wedding. The hotel hallway buzzed with whispers as word spread. Guests recalled hearing shouting, a loud thud, then silence. Some had even pressed their ears to their doors, too nervous to intervene. Now, police officers taped off the suite, their radios crackling as they prepared to take statements. Bobby sat slumped in a chair, his hands buried in his face. It was an accident, he kept repeating, his voice hoarse. I didn't mean to hurt her. But the detectives, exchanging glances, weren't convinced. The marks on Sarah's body, the bruises on her wrists, the indentation of weight across her chest. These were not the signs of an accident. By sunrise, what had begun as a celebration was already being rewritten as a tragedy. Reporters swarmed outside the hotel, their headlines brutal in their simplicity. The 500-pound honeymoon murder. And for the people of Greenwood, who had watched Sarah walk down the aisle less than 24 hours earlier, the whispers that had followed the couple for months turned into a collective gasp. The fairy tale had ended, and all that remained was the question of how love could curdle into violence so quickly. The flashing red and blue lights painted the hotel's polished lobby in harsh, unnatural colors. Guests in silk gowns and wrinkled suits, still smelling faintly of champagne and perfume from the reception hours earlier, clustered in small groups, whispering as uniformed officers hurried past them. What had been a luxury honeymoon suite only hours before was now sealed off with crime scene tape, the door guarded by a deputy who kept shaking his head as though even he couldn't believe what had unfolded inside. Detective Carla Hughes was among the first to arrive. A seasoned investigator from Dallas PD, she carried herself with the steady calm of someone who had seen more than her share of tragedies. She stepped into the room and froze briefly, her eyes taking in the scene. Sarah Collins lay motionless on the bed, a white sheet pulled over her body by paramedics who had long since stopped trying to revive her. Her arms hung limp over the sides, pale skin already showing the beginnings of bruises. The air still carried the scent of roses from the wedding bouquet, now toppled on the nightstand. Across the room sat Bobby Hale, hunched over in a chair, his large hands trembling as he wiped at his tear-streaked face. His tuxedo shirt was half torn, his bow tie discarded on the floor. It was an accident, he kept mumbling, his voice low and broken. We were just playing around. She couldn't breathe. I didn't mean it. Hughes studied him for a long moment before motioning to a uniformed officer. Get him some water, and don't let him out of your sight. The initial survey of the room raised more questions than it answered. The bedspread was twisted and bunched, a lamp on the nightstand had toppled, and one of Sarah's earrings was found several feet from the bed. The champagne glasses sat untouched, condensation dripping down their sides. Hughes crouched near Sarah's purse, the phone inside buzzing with unread notifications. A quick glance revealed text messages that made her frown. One was from earlier that night, just hours before her death. I miss you. Wish you were here. Sent to a contact labeled Mark. By dawn, the medical examiner confirmed what Hughes already suspected. Sarah had died from asphyxiation. There were faint ligature marks along her wrists, consistent with being held down, and deep bruising across her chest and neck. This wasn't a fainting spell, the examiner said quietly as the body was wheeled out. She was forced into this. The detectives began canvassing the floor. Guests in the surrounding rooms were quick to talk, some out of genuine concern, others eager to be part of the story already spreading through the hotel. A couple from Louisiana, staying just across the hall, recalled hearing a woman shouting, followed by a loud thud. We thought maybe it was just honeymoon stuff, the husband admitted sheepishly. But then it got quiet. Too quiet. Another guest said she heard Sarah cry out, "Stop, Bobby," before everything went silent. Back downstairs, Hughes sat across from Bobby in a quiet conference room. His enormous frame dwarfed the chair, and his voice wavered as he spoke. She was my wife, he insisted, his hands trembling as he pressed them against his chest. I loved her. She couldn't breathe. I'm a big guy, you know. Sometimes things get out of control. But it wasn't murder. Then why the bruises on her wrists? Hughes asked evenly. Bobby swallowed hard. She struggled. She panicked. I tried to hold her still, to calm her down. Hughes leaned in, her tone sharpened. Calm her down, or stop her from fighting back. The room fell into silence. Bobby's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, the only sound was the buzz of the overhead light. As word spread, the media descended like vultures. The headlines were merciless. Texas bride dead after honeymoon fight, the 500-pound groom, and the night of violence. Outside the hotel, cameras rolled as reporters shouted questions. Did Sarah marry for money? Did Bobby snap under pressure? Or had the whispers of infidelity been true all along? Meanwhile, Sarah's phone continued to tell its own story. Investigators pulled records showing dozens of messages exchanged with Mark Bennett in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Most were harmless, catching up, sharing old memories, but others hinted at lingering feelings. On the very night she died, Sarah had texted him from the hotel suite. The last message, sent minutes before Bobby confronted her, read simply, "I don't know if I made the right choice." To detectives, it was damning. Bobby had motive, jealousy, betrayal, humiliation. He had means, his overwhelming size and strength. And now, they had evidence of opportunity, with witnesses who'd heard the fight and a timeline that fit too neatly to ignore. By the time Bobby was escorted from the hotel in handcuffs, the whispers in Greenwood had turned to outright condemnation. The wedding that was supposed to silence the doubters had instead confirmed their worst suspicions. And for Detective Hughes, the case was no longer about what had happened. It was about proving whether this was a tragic accident or a calculated act of violence. Either way, Sarah Collins was dead, and her fairy tale had ended before it ever really began. Detective Carla Hughes had handled jealous husbands before, but something about Bobby Hale's case gnawed at her. His story didn't sit right. He claimed it was an accident, that his size had worked against him, that he had only been trying to hold Sarah still. But the scene told a different story, one of rage and control. And in cases like this, she knew the truth always lingered in the details. The first crack appeared in Bobby's own words. In his initial statement to police, he said Sarah had fainted while they were being intimate. Hours later, when interviewed again, he said she stopped breathing suddenly after she panicked. The language shifted, the timeline blurred. When Hughes pressed him on why neighbors heard Sarah scream his name, followed by silence, Bobby shook his head, insisting they don't know what they heard. They're making it sound worse. To Hughes, that sounded less like grief and more like deflection. Forensics began to dismantle Bobby's version of events. The bruising on Sarah's wrists wasn't random. It showed clear signs of restraint, fingers digging deep into her skin. The medical examiner confirmed that the pressure marks on her chest were consistent with being pinned by a weight far greater than her own. This was sustained, the examiner explained, not a momentary accident. She struggled for a while before her body gave out. That fact alone undercut Bobby's claims of a sudden, tragic mishap. But the most damning discoveries came from Sarah's phone. Detectives scrolled through weeks of texts with her old boyfriend, Mark Bennett. At first, the messages seemed like nostalgia, old memories, jokes from high school. But as the wedding drew closer, the tone shifted. Sarah admitted she felt trapped, that she wasn't sure marrying Bobby was the right choice. Hours before her death, she texted Mark, "He's watching me like a hawk. I feel like I can't breathe around him." Minutes later came the fatal message, "I don't know if I made the right choice." Investigators also uncovered Bobby's own digital trail. On his laptop back at the ranch, a search history painted a chilling picture. Just days before the wedding, Bobby had typed, "Can a man's weight crush someone in bed?" And accidental suffocation during sex legal consequences. These weren't idle curiosities. They were the questions of a man already haunted by what he feared he might do. Detective Hughes confronted Bobby with this evidence during another interrogation. Sitting across the table, she slid printed text messages across to him. She was still talking to Mark, Hughes said evenly. She had doubts. "That night you found out. You were angry." Bobby's face flushed, his massive hands gripping the edge of the table. "She promised me," he muttered, shaking his head. "She said she was done with him. But she lied. They always lie." "Who's they, Bobby?" Hughes pressed. "All of them," he snapped before catching himself. His breathing grew shallow, his words stumbling. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I just wanted her to stop lying. To look at me. To love me." It was the closest thing to a confession Hughes would get. Meanwhile, prosecutors built their case piece by piece. Witnesses who had stayed on the 12th floor came forward with consistent accounts. A woman's raised voice, a crash, a scream cut off abruptly. The maid who cleaned their suite earlier testified that she noticed Sarah seemed distracted, even nervous, clutching her phone tightly when Bobby stepped away. Friends told investigators Sarah had confided second thoughts about the marriage but felt pressured to go through with it. The picture that emerged was devastating. A man so consumed by jealousy and insecurity that when faced with proof of betrayal, real or imagined, he snapped. By the time the grand jury convened, the evidence was overwhelming. The bruises, the texts, the internet searches, the eyewitness accounts, all pointed to one conclusion. Bobby Hale had not accidentally killed his bride. He had murdered her in a jealous rage less than 24 hours after saying, "I do." The indictment for second-degree murder was handed down swiftly. And as news broke, Greenwood erupted. The whispers that had followed Sarah and Bobby's courtship turned into a roar. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, microphones ready, repeating the story to a national audience. In jail, Bobby struggled with the same health problems that had dogged him for years. Guards noted how quickly his bravado crumbled. At night, they said, he sobbed loudly enough for others to hear. Still, when Hughes visited one final time to deliver the indictment, his pride flickered. "She made a fool out of me," he said bitterly, staring at the table. "And fools don't get happy endings." Hughes left the room without responding. For her, the case was no longer about why Bobby did it, jealousy, humiliation, years of buried resentment. It was about giving Sarah's family the truth, the one thing Bobby never could. The fairy tale wedding that Greenwood had gossiped about for months was now officially a murder case. And as the trial loomed, the entire town braced itself to watch the story play out in public, every painful detail dragged into the light. The trial of Robert "Bobby" Hale began the following spring, but the buzz around Greenwood hadn't cooled in the months since Sarah Collins' death. If anything, the anticipation only grew. Every local diner conversation circled back to it, every newspaper headline teased it, and when jury selection started, television vans lined the courthouse steps. The story had all the ingredients of a media storm. A beautiful bride, a wealthy but insecure groom, a wedding turned to tragedy in less than 24 hours. The cameras called it the 500-pound honeymoon murder, and no one in town could look away. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Bobby appeared in a dark suit that strained across his frame, his hands folded tightly in front of him as he was led to the defense table. He looked smaller than he once had. Jail food and stress had trimmed him down, but still imposing, his heavy breathing audible in the otherwise hushed room. Across the aisle sat Sarah's family, her mother clutching a folded handkerchief, her father stiff and silent, staring straight ahead at the man accused of killing his daughter. The prosecution wasted no time painting Bobby as a man consumed by jealousy and fear of abandonment. Assistant District Attorney Carlin Gwynn addressed the jury with a calm but forceful tone. "This was not an accident," she declared. "This was rage. A rage that erupted when Robert Hale discovered his wife of less than 24 hours was still in contact with another man. Faced with rejection, he did what insecure, controlling men often do. He tried to assert dominance. And in doing so, he took her life." Gwynn laid out the evidence in methodical detail. The bruising on Sarah's wrists and chest, the medical examiner's testimony that her death was consistent with sustained pressure, not a fleeting accident. She read aloud Sarah's text messages to her ex, the words "I don't know if I made the right choice" echoing through the courtroom like a ghost. And she showed Bobby's own internet searches. Can a man's weight crush someone in bed? Proof, she argued, that Bobby had contemplated the very scenario he later claimed was a tragic mishap. The defense countered with a different narrative. Bobby's attorney, Samuel Breyer, acknowledged the tragedy but insisted it was never intentional. "Mr. Hale is not a monster," Breyer said, pacing slowly before the jury. "He is a man whose size has been the subject of ridicule his entire life. He finally found someone who said yes to him, and he loved her deeply. But love can be clumsy. Love can be desperate. On their wedding night, in an intimate moment, things went horribly wrong. He didn't mean to hurt her. He didn't mean to kill her. It was an accident made worse by his physical condition and his insecurities. Breyer called character witnesses who described Bobby as generous, kind, even gentle. A family friend testified that Bobby had once paid for her son's college tuition. Another described him as the kind of man who'd give you the shirt off his back. But under cross-examination, Nguyen cut through those portrayals. Was he also the kind of man who searched online about suffocating someone just days before his wife's death? She asked pointedly. The witness faltered, the courtroom holding its breath as the question hung in the air. The emotional peak came when Sarah's best friend took the stand. She told the jury about late-night phone calls in which Sarah admitted she was unsure about marrying Bobby, about how he made her feel watched and cornered. She wanted stability, the friend said through tears. But she also wanted love, and she wasn't sure she had both. The friend's voice cracked as she described Sarah's final text the night she died. Members of the jury shifted uncomfortably, some visibly moved. Throughout it all, Bobby sat hunched, occasionally dabbing at his eyes with a tissue. When he finally took the stand in his own defense, his voice shook. "I loved her," he said, staring at the jury as if pleading for mercy. "I never wanted to hurt her. She was my whole world. She was my chance to prove I was worth something." He insisted again that it had been an accident, that he had only been trying to hold her close when she stopped breathing. But under Nguyen's sharp questioning, his story unraveled. She pressed him about the bruises, the witnesses, the texts. His answers grew contradictory, his voice rising, his frustration spilling over. "She lied to me," he blurted at one point, his face red. "She was never really mine." The courtroom fell silent at the outburst, the jury staring at him with wide eyes. After 2 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated less than a day before returning with a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Bobby lowered his head, his massive shoulders trembling as the words were read. Sarah's mother wept quietly, gripping her husband's hand. At sentencing, the judge spoke directly to Bobby. "You were given a gift, a woman who chose to marry you. And instead of cherishing her, you let your insecurities and your anger destroy her. This court cannot undo what was done, but it can ensure justice is served." He sentenced Bobby to 25 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 15. As deputies led him away in shackles, reporters rushed to file their stories. Outside, the cameras captured every reaction, every tear, every shouted question. For Greenwood, the trial was both an ending and a confirmation. The whispers had been true, the doubts justified. The fairy tale wedding had indeed been a tragedy waiting to happen. And for the family of Sarah Collins, there was no sense of victory, only the hollow relief that the man who had taken her life would never again walk free. When the verdict was read and the cameras packed up, Greenwood was left with a silence heavier than before. The wedding that had once been the town's spectacle became a ghost story whispered over coffee and in church pews. The grand images of Sarah in her white lace gown, smiling beneath the church's stained glass windows, were replaced by newspaper headlines and courtroom sketches of Bobby hunched at the defense table. The town couldn't shake the feeling that they had all watched a tragedy unfold in plain sight. Sarah's funeral was a somber affair, held in the same church where she had spoken her vows only days before her death. White lilies lined the altar, but the air was thick with grief and disbelief. Her parents sat in the front pew, her mother clutching a framed photo of Sarah as a child, her father staring forward with a hollow expression. Friends wept openly, some whispering about how they had tried to warn her, others wrestling with guilt that they hadn't done more. Outside, television cameras caught the mourners streaming out, their faces etched with sorrow, their voices quiet. Bobby's name became shorthand for the darkest kind of betrayal. In prison, he was notorious almost instantly, not for violence, but for the way his story spread. Guards nicknamed him the Groom. Other inmates taunted him, reminding him daily of how quickly his fairy tale had collapsed. His health deteriorated under the weight of stress and confinement, his once booming laugh replaced by silence. Some said he still cried at night, whispering Sarah's name, but by then, few believed his grief was pure. For Sarah's family, the trial and sentencing provided only partial closure. Justice had been served, but it didn't bring her back. Her mother began attending victim advocacy groups, speaking softly but powerfully about the dangers of ignoring red flags in relationships. Her father, quieter by nature, kept to himself, maintaining Sarah's childhood room exactly as she had left it. In town, friends set up a scholarship fund in her name, determined that her life would not only be remembered for how it ended. The media, of course, moved on to the next case, the next scandal. The case became a shorthand for betrayal and violence, retold in documentaries and podcasts. Documentaries replayed the story, complete with dramatic reenactments and ominous music. True crime podcasts dissected every detail, from Bobby's internet searches to Sarah's last text messages. Each retelling made the tragedy feel more surreal, more like fiction than the brutal reality it was. Among locals, opinions remained divided. Some insisted Sarah had made a calculated choice, marrying for money and underestimating the danger. Others believed she had been trapped, caught between financial security and a man whose insecurities grew too heavy to bear. Most agreed on one thing. The signs had been there, the possessiveness, the whispers of doubt. And yet, no one thought it would end with a young woman's life cut short. Detective Carla Hughes, who had carried the case from the hotel suite to the courtroom, reflected later in an interview. People ask me if I think Bobby meant to kill her. And I tell them, intent doesn't erase outcome. She's gone because he couldn't control his anger, his fear of being abandoned. Whether he meant it or not doesn't change what he did. Years later, Greenwood still bore the scar. The hotel suite was scrubbed clean, rented out again to strangers who never knew its history, but locals avoided booking weddings there. The church pew where Sarah had once walked to say, "I do," seemed heavier, a reminder of how quickly joy could collapse in a tragedy. The story became a cautionary tale, not just about jealousy or size or money, but about the danger of ignoring doubt when it whispers in the back of your mind. Sarah had silenced hers long enough to walk down the aisle, and it cost her everything. In the end, her life was remembered not only as a tragedy, but as a warning. Love without trust is fragile. Love without honesty is dangerous. And when fear and insecurity are allowed to fester, even a wedding dressed in roses and lace can end with sirens in the night.